Hitler and the Nazi Darwinian worldview. It's an important topic because, to summarize, World War II was a war between creation and evolution, and creation won. And when I say that, some of you, I hope, are saying, yeah, right. What did you drink before you got here? What's going on? Well, I hope that you question what I have to say, because I have 3 books which deal with hundreds of references which support what I am saying. And as I present the material, you have something to think about. Okay, the ideology was the Greater German Empire, and this is from Thomas Childers, who was one of the leading researchers of Germany during World War II. The Greater German Empire was to be a racially pure empire. Germany was the last best racial hope of mankind. In other words, the inferior races were growing, and Germany was determined to stem the tide of all of these inferior peoples. That's what he's saying. Viktor Frankl, he was actually a Holocaust victim. He was in a Holocaust camp, and he said, a lot of insight here. And what he said, the gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of hereditary and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. Doesn't this sound familiar? Evolution? I'm absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry in Berlin, but rather at the desks and the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. A very accurate, succinct review of what's going on. Now, there's a book published by the Holocaust Museum, incredibly well illustrated, accurate book. And basically, what they did was they took internationally recognized authorities on Nazism, and they demonstrated that the scientific establishment was crucial in planning and carrying out the Holocaust. And of course, what was the beliefs of scientists in Nazi Germany at this time? Very simply, they were evolution. How do you get there? Charles Darwin originated the theory. It went from Darwin to Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel then spread it throughout and bragged about this. He spread it throughout not only his university, but the universities of Germany. So you put all these accurate quotes together, what do we see? What was taught in the universities? Darwinism. And if you read Mein Kampf, you will notice that many of the phrases in that book appear to be right out of Darwin's Origin of Species. Very, very close. Of course, Darwin's Origin of Species was in English. Mein Kampf was in German. You translate it, look at it, you can see it's very, very clear. Okay. This is a couple of books I've written about this topic. The Darwin Effect talks about not only Nazism, but also it talks about the effect of Darwin on society. Slaughter of the Dissidents is a book that I wrote, which deals with the effects of Darwinism. Basically, there's a lot of parallels between Darwinism and Nazism. And there's obviously not all parallels, but the parallels are very clear. Both use propaganda techniques. Darwinism is everywhere, and I'll give you a few examples. To relax at night, I'm a night person. I like to sleep late, work late. My wife doesn't appreciate that. She likes to go to bed early and get up early. But, you know, we love each other, so you just deal with it. So one thing I do at night is watch films. I have films on Nazi Germany, World War II, literally, they're DVDs, literally this high. I've spent hundreds of hours watching the films that I have. And the key to Nazism, as these films clearly bring out, was you have to control the schools, the media, the radio, public thought. In the last presentation, somebody mentioned the fact that Hitler ensured that every family in Germany had a radio. And guess what was on that radio? The propaganda for Nazism. And so it's clear from the history, and this is not controversial. I mean, I have probably 2,000 books on Nazism, and it's clearly well documented in the history that is recorded in these books, relying heavily upon documents in German. And that's the book Deadly Medicine, which I mentioned. Extremely well done book. And that's the book I wrote, which, in case you question what I have to say, that's good, right? Fine, read the book. It's well documented. There we can see Hitler. Very famous pictures. And there we can see the Nazi salute. Okay, let's give some definitions. From nothing to everything by chance, time, natural law, and natural selection. That's evolution. Okay, or from the goo to you by way of the zoo. That's trickier, but it's far easier to remember. And my conclusion is, evolution is true, only it is going the wrong way. And to achieve this, I'll skip some of these slides. To try to gather that belief, we look at Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. So the first goal, according to Mein Kampf, was you have to take over the churches. Secondly, you have to reward people who are following the Nazi propaganda line. And a few examples of these are the cross here, you can see in the center here, the cross. And this was a reward they gave to, who do you think? Mothers who had big families. Why? In war, you obviously lose a lot of soldiers. And therefore, it was critically important that these soldiers be replaced. And it was critically important that if we are going to produce the superior race, one way, the best way of doing that is having superior men, superior women have big families. It's one way of producing more of the superior race. And this is, if I can read that here, die Deutsche Mutter. And there we can see a party assembly which says several things. One thing is that actually few people resisted. Some did, but relatively few. One that you should know is Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of the main exceptions. He was part of a movement called the Confessing Church. And of the members of the German churches, Confessing Church claimed about a third. About a third were neutral. And if you think about it, not to decide is to decide. A third were aggressively supportive of the Nazi movement. So basically, Hitler had behind him 2/3 of the Nazi, of the church. But the main opposition was the churches and Christians. And there are many Christians which Jews today honor as what they call the righteous Gentiles, because they resisted Nazism. Something that should be stressed is that the churches stand up, we have an enormous amount of power. And we have a lot of people. And one example, which the recent election of President Trump, some people credit that to the churches, because many, especially the Baptist conservative churches, were the sermons, and I've listened to a few by, just turned them on and there they were, and they basically were very supportive of Trump. They recognized he wasn't exactly a very moral person in many ways. He had a lot of flaws, but we are electing not a pastor, we are electing someone to run the country. And the conclusion of many of these pastors was, of a bad and a worse choice, there you go. And so a lot of historians feel that a major reason that Trump won was because of the support of the churches. And a number of well-known Christians that you're all aware of were very active in this area. So shall we involve ourselves in the church, in the secular parts of the world? Well, some people feel we should. Some people, as too, don't. And this wall of righteous Gentiles, guess what that can, if I can talk here. Does somebody have some water? Maybe they could, my throat's giving out. Maybe a glass of water would be. This righteous Gentiles, most of them were Christians. And so it's true that even though a large number of Christians capitulated with Nazism, still the main opposition was the churches. Okay, to control propaganda, one of the first steps was to control the schools. And you can see here a typical school, and you can see the Nazi flag, and therefore you can see that the propaganda is there. It's very obvious. Then control the textbooks. Then control the textbooks. In fact, Hitler said, let me control the textbooks and I will control the state. So what we find, thank you very much. What we find is we see exactly that to some degree being practiced in the churches. To summarize, and I've written whole books on this, but to summarize, basically there are two worldviews. One worldview is evolution. Worldviews tell us where we came from, why we're here, and where we're going. Evolution says where we came from, we evolved, why are we here? To survive. Where are we going? When we die, and that's it. Christianity says, why are we here? Where did we come from? God created us. For what purpose? Why are we here? To serve our fellow man and to serve God. Where are we going? Heaven or hell. So two worldviews, and the state's courts, and there are over 200 cases, which I've documented in my books, over 200 cases, the courts have said basically, you cannot teach the Christian worldview. You must teach the evolution worldview, and you cannot criticize the evolution worldview, because by doing such, you are backdoor teaching creation. And you must not, get that right? You must not criticize evolution, because by doing so, this is backdoor creation. And the next step would be, you cannot present evidence against evolution. You must present only evidence for evolution. The goal of Nazism was to indoctrinate the youth. The goal of the humanist, atheist, if we could call it that movement, was the same, to indoctrinate the youth. I just talked to a friend of mine in Canada, and he mentioned that in all the Christian schools, the last 2 years, they must teach evolution as fact. in the Christian schools. And by and large, the same is true in this country. Even in nations we conquer, we must spread the Nazi worldview, then everyone else. Nazism basically accepted a worldview that we today call eugenics. Eugenics is the idea that we can breed better humans. And that means the better humans should have larger families, which is what the reward for mothers with big families got and why. And secondly, we must reduce the population of inferior human beings by sterilization or by other means. And of course, the United States, we did this primarily by sterilization. California and Indiana were the leading countries that sterilized what they thought were inferior individuals. And in Nazi Germany, they took this one step further. They not only sterilized them, they murdered them. And so the Nuremberg trials, as is well known, when they were arguing for leniency or not guilty, they basically said, why are you condemning us when we got our ideas, and they could quote word for word from American eugenicists. Why condemn us? But of course, we reminded them, we just sterilized them, and they murdered them. Okay, a letter to Darwin. Galton was the one who developed the idea of eugenics. He wrote, the appearance of your Origin of Species formed a real crisis in my life. Your book drove away the constraint of my old superstition as if it had been a nightmare, and was the first to give me freedom of thought. What was this freedom of thought? Very simply, this freedom of thought was the idea that we can control genetics by encouraging superior persons to reproduce, and by euthanizing, or of course Galton didn't want to do that. He wanted to basically use sterilization. And of course, it's well known, there are many examples of this, where they use science in order to defend their position. Here's some eye colors. They use these charts in order to determine if you are Aryan or not. And this is an interesting point. If Jews were so inferior, why do they have to go through all these tests? I mean, it should be obvious. But obviously it wasn't, because many Jews looked just like Aryans, which of course clearly went against Hitler's ideology. But nonetheless, he was determined to let the scientists do the work, and the scientists used scientific means in order to determine who was a member of inferior race. What does Christianity have to say about this? Christianity makes it very clear, as all of you know, that we all are descendants of Adam and Eve. Therefore, we all are brothers and sisters, or at least distant cousins. If we all have the same back far enough parents, there can be no inferior race. And creationists especially really stress this, because so much racism has existed in the world, including in the United States. And therefore, if they would have followed the Christian worldview, then this racism would not have happened, obviously. And there you can see a testing of two boys. They look to me like good-looking Aryan kids. Well, they want to be sure, so they use the eye chart to determine if they were inferior or not. And there, in case you know what someone who looks like that, she would be a typical Aryan woman. Actually, it's interesting in a sense, in that Hitler thought the superior Aryans was the Swedes. The Germans were not as pure as the Swedes, and this girl is Swedish. And then, of course, they had to measure noses And there we can see Corporal Goldberg. He was the ideal German soldier. His picture was plastered throughout books and articles and posters until they found out he was a Jew. Little problem. And there again is the Swede, the ideal Swede. There are two German Jews, and again, if it's so obvious that they're inferior, why wear a sign? I mean, what's the point of wearing a sign? Okay, anti-Jewish ideas. Hitler was confident that the world would someday thank him for eliminating this rotten parasitic race, even if Germany lost the war. And the best example, there are many examples of that, but the best example was when Germany was losing the war toward the end of the war in Russia, they had a choice between supporting the troops, sending supplies, guns, etc. to the troops, or carrying the Jews to the concentration camps. And the decision was, we need to send the Jews to the concentration camps, because even if we lose the war, at least we've won the war against Jews. So the core of Nazism was Jews were morally inferior, and the next sentence came out of Hitler's book. Christianity was a bastard of Judaism and must eventually be destroyed. We know, of course, that obviously the Christian religion came from the Hebrew Scriptures. It's based on it. In fact, we have a Jew in one of our Bible studies, and he's really helpful because, as he has said, he knows the Hebrew Scriptures really well. As he has said, you cannot understand the New Testament without also understanding the Hebrew Scriptures. And he was there to help us understand so much which many of us were not aware of. Where did this come from? Why did they say this? Why did they do that? Because it's based in Judaism. So Christianity must be destroyed, but first we need to focus on the inferior races. Jews, primarily. Poles were also considered to be inferior. About 5 million Poles were mercilessly slaughtered. Adolf Hitler and his top Nazi leaders were products of German education, science, and the prevailing social worldview of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Their participation, the Germans, in what was one of the most infamous episodes of human suffering and death in the history of humans could possibly have been predicted if we would have understood the basis of the Nazi Holocaust. Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The Führer is deeply anti-Christian. He regards Christianity as a symptom of decay," and rightly so. Why oppose Christianity? Well, many reasons. One is Darwinism stresses, and there are many quotes from his work which support this, Darwinism stresses elimination of the weak. Not that we should go out and eliminate the weak, but they will be. Eventually, when a superior race meets an inferior race, Darwin said the superior race will always win. Eventually, the inferior race will always be eliminated. What were the inferior race? Well, Jews, Slavics, especially Poles, Negroes. Wasn't worried so much about Negroes, partially because there was hardly any in Germany at that time. So that wasn't the concern. The superior race would be pure Aryans, German and Scandinavians especially, the Swedes. And as I mentioned, most opposition was from Christians. Ernst Haeckel is a leading Darwinist in Germany. He read Charles Darwin's work, and as I mentioned, he accepted it, and he, in his own words, was converting, trying to convert, doing what he could to convert all Germans to Darwinism. And he certainly was, in many ways, successful. There's Haeckel, as an old man. And Haeckel was interesting because he was a really good artist. And these are a few examples. A few more examples. Okay, some examples of evolution which were taught in Germany were, we start out with the superior race. Right up. Oh, this is doing the wrong thing now. Okay, well you can see in the upper there's the superior race and there's a monkey. So they evolved from the monkey slowly up the Negroes and eventually the superior race. And then this is the one measurement they use. They use the facial angle to determine inferiority and superiority. And again, Joseph Mengele, he had an interesting background. He had an MD and he had a PhD in evolutionary biology. And he was endeavoring to learn about the inferior races, and he did the infamous medical experiments in, of course, Auschwitz. Especially he used, as scientists have used today, twins. Study of twins was important to determine the influence of race and environment. So the goal was to understand, of these harmful traits, which ones came from the race, which ones are a result of the environment. And that's what Mengele focused on. And he injected subjects with a variety of chemicals to determine, and some of these are stupid, we recognize today, but he injected them with a variety of chemicals, the Jews, to see how they were affected. For example, what is the easiest way to kill somebody? Is gasoline better than strychnine? What's the cost? Which is cheaper? Gasoline. So therefore, they for a while used gasoline to eliminate the individuals they were trying to eliminate. Starved them to see which race lived the longest. So he must have had some Aryan criminals, so he starved the Aryan criminals, and the Jews wanted to see which one lived longer. He vacuumed subjects until their lungs ruptured. He froze subjects to see how long they could live. The reason for that was if a plane crashes near the cold area, near the poles, if he crashed an hour and a half ago, should we bother to rescue him? So they're trying to find out how long it would take before the soldier would die. So they didn't want to waste planes or Nazis on trying to save somebody who's already dead. So they timed how long it would take to die, and if the plane crashed 3 hours ago, it's likely dead, so they didn't bother to try to pick up the victim. And here you can see is one example of the research they did. And this is pressure research that they used. High altitude decompression research was also done. There you can see millions of bodies had to be disposed of. There you can see a poster wanted Dr. Joseph Mengele after the World War ended, of course. The interesting thing was we see him as a horrible, awful criminal. Considering what he did, that's a pretty logical judgment. It's interesting, when he was in Argentina, that his house was right by a very sharp curve. And he was asked if a car didn't make the curve, crashed, and the people in there were alive, would you try to save them, even though you might be caught and sent back to Germany and executed? And without thinking, Mengele said, of course I would. I'm a doctor. My job is to save people. And if I knew there's a good chance I would be exposed and sent back to Germany and executed, if I helped save these people, I would save the people. And there are many things, it's hard to believe such an evil person could do such evil things and yet be, in many ways, a noble person. So the Nazi goes to replace the Bible with Mein Kampf. Hermann Göring, second most powerful man in Germany. And there we can see Hermann Göring was. In many ways, he was behind the Nazi movement. Was he a Darwinist? Yes, very strongly so. And I cover this in my book, which I mention and support. All of the leading Nazis were all Darwinists. So Hitler didn't have to goad him to do what he did. He already knew Darwin was true, and therefore we have to eliminate or reduce inferior races. Heinrich Himmler, same thing. He was a strongly Darwinist. He was the Reichsführer of the SS. He commanded and expanded the Gestapo. He became chief of all German police in 1936 and Minister of the Interior in 1943. He studied biology. He was the overseer of the concentration camps. He directed the killing of 6 million Jews and between 200 and 500,000 Romani, or Egyptians, or not Egyptian, but Gypsies. There we go. And there we can see Himmler. He died by strychnine poisoning. He knew he was caught. He was finished. Another Darwinist, Joseph Goebbels. He had a PhD from a German university, University of Heidelberg. And this is his daughter, Helga. All his children, their names started with H in honor of Hitler. There's a picture of the family. He had, I guess, 9 kids, him and his wife. The person at the top was his wife's son from a first marriage. Very strongly against the scriptures. The children were knocked out with morphine by an SS doctor, then had cyanide capsules pressed between their teeth, and they all died. And Goebbels then shot his wife and last himself, and you can see there's a picture of Goebbels after he was burned. Julius Streicher, and again he was aggressive, anti-Christian, and also an aggressive supporter of Nazism. And there you can see the support they had in Germany. Here are 2 of many magazines which, again, propaganda over and over and over. They said things that were derogatory towards Jews, and we see the same propaganda in the area of evolution. I mentioned a pile of DVDs this high. I also have a pile of DVDs twice as high on nature, on history, and all of them push evolution. I just watched one on cats, and guess what? Every time you turn around, this cat evolved into that cat, this other cat evolved into another cat. They constantly pushed evolution in these films on cats. One thing that's intriguing is I was looking for evidence. They had none. They just said, here's a house cat, and here's a Siamese cat, and one evolved, and by breeding they could have evolved from one to the other. But they said slowly by evolution, by mutations, etc., one evolved into the other. And Julius Streicher was one of the few Nazis that were hanged that were, I hate to say bitter, but he felt justified by what he did. Several other of the Nazis that were convicted asked God for forgiveness. The source of the idea. Well, Darwin, his goal was he wanted to murder God. How do you do that? You do that because why do people believe in God? The main reason people believe in God is the evidence of their senses. The natural world, bees, flowers, the mountains, the sunset, dogs. All of this convinces people there must be a God. Darwin himself, when he was studying at the University of Cambridge, he studied Paley's book. Paley basically argued from design. We find a watch at the roadside. Where did it come from? It obviously was made by a watchmaker. Likewise, when we look at the natural world, where did this natural world come from? Obviously, it was created by a creator. So how do you destroy God? You destroy the reason people believe in God. Therefore, what he did was he came up with an alternative to creationism, and that alternative was evolution. So therefore, we believe in evolution because, so many do, because, well, it's proven. They feel. And the mass media constantly presents evolution as being proven. Example of this is, and there are many examples, but an example of this is the fact that so many people, they're Christians, raised as creationists, they go to college, they learn about evolution, and they become evolutionists. One of my grandchildren, he was reared a creationist. He went to high school. In his high school biology book, they covered evolution. Evidence is all these useless organs, the appendix and tonsils and so on. And I tried to talk to him about this. And basically he said, my teacher's really smart. Evolution is fact. I believe in evolution. That's where we came from, because it's very logical. So in one class, in high school, he accepted the evolutionary worldview. Okay, Darwinism is the engine that drives atheism. Well, we could quote from many people. Richard Dawkins himself said, evolution allows one to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Before this time, how could you accept atheism? You have the natural world, which for most of us was proof of a creator. Well, now with evolution, we don't need the creation. We can accept the evidence of evolution as the source of us. Top scientists, studies consistently show about 98% are atheists. And in numerous studies, and this is what we find. Why? Because they are exposed to atheism, and more important, exposed to evolution in most of their career. I mentioned this before, and some people said, boy, this is pessimistic. Let me mention that there is more evidence today against evolution than ever before in history. A good example is, I am obligated to write 2 articles a week, about 1,000 words, and the past year I've written 500,000 words. And I've been doing this for 40 years. And the evidence against evolution is absolutely, unequivocally there. Just no evidence for evolution. One quick example is, evolution claims to work by mutations. We have genetic variety. Where does it come from? It comes from mutations. We know a lot about mutations. When I worked at the medical school, that's what I worked on, was mutations. So we know a lot about mutations. And we know that the vast majority of mutations are deleterious. They're not beneficial. So in essence, evolution says you are the result of billions of genetic mistakes. And if that's true, you need to make an appointment with your doctor to sit on the CAT scan for an hour or so, get plenty of radiation, you'll have plenty of mutations, and you'll become a genius. Well, actually, when you're pregnant, you go to the hospital, sit under the CAT scan, make sure that that womb gets lots of mutations, and you'll end up with you know what you'll end up with. In fact, if you mention that to the staff, they would probably call some gentlemen in white coats because you know that mutations is not going to, by and large, improve you. Occasionally there are mutations which are beneficial, but the vast majority are not beneficial. And that is one of the best arguments against the idea that evolution can produce all life. Result of lots of mutations. Clearly there. So why is it believed? Well, as I mentioned, social factors. Most people conform. A good example of that is an article I just wrote where several scientists like Richard Dawkins and others wrote an article and said that there are only 2 sexes. There are males and there are females. And all animals are either a male or a female, and this transsexual business is nonsense. That's what the evolutionists said. Well, for that, these evolutionists who said this were a member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And as a result of saying that sentence, the others were so upset that they forced the group, the Without Religion, World Without Religion group, to resign. They all were resigned. None of them, and it's the hatred against even people like Dawkins. I'm an evolutionist, I believe in evolution. I'm an atheist, I believe in atheism, but Darwin's ideas are true, but Richard Dawkins is a bigot, and he's no way he should be allowed to post any information on our Freedom from Religion Foundation website. So and this is just in a couple of years. 4 years ago, could you imagine somebody saying, well, I think that my 12-year-old son wants to be a girl, let's start doing some surgery. Let's start giving him hormone treatment. 2 or 3 years ago, if you said that, they probably would call the white coats. Because this has been seen throughout history as ludicrous. Boys are boys, girls are girls, end of story. Now, within a few years, it has been changed so much that so many people see this idea that girls who say they're boys are boys. And that's one of the articles that Dawkins and others were protesting. What's a girl? A girl is a person who says he's a girl. What's a female? Female is somebody who says they're female. Well, the biologists didn't accept that for good reason. Social pressure, only atheism, and is taught in many of the higher, especially the philosophy departments, and higher education focuses on the beliefs of evolution. 2 books theory. God wrote 2 books. The Word, His Word, and Works. And we tend to, in churches, stress, which we should, His Word, but we, by and large, ignore His works. We can learn about God not only by studying His Word, but also by, well, the heavens declare the glory of God. By studying the heavens, and I have a whole book out there of atheists who became believers as a result of studying the creation. They have said you cannot study the world without recognizing behind the world is a creator. That's called the 2 books theory. A long time ago, if you went to seminary 150, 200 years ago, you would study a course called Natural Theology. When you open a book up called Natural Theology, what's in there? Botany, math, zoology. So the ministers, through most of history, they learned a lot about the natural world because they realized when you're studying about God's works, you are studying about God. And the important fact is that we've lost that, and I think that's one reason why so many pastors and so many church members accept the evolutionary worldview. We need to study both of God's books. All too often we're studying half of the theology. Darwin, by the way, thought the cell was an amorphous blob. What's in it? Well, not much. Now we know the cell is the most complex system in the world. I taught cell biology, and it's a hard class to teach because the cell is so enormously complex. I taught microbiology, and students, oh, that's easy. Yeah, we all know about germs. Yeah, they say that until we get to the chapter on the cell, biological cells used in bacteria. Then when they study bacterial cells, they realize how complex it is, very clearly. Going back to World War II, it's interesting that this is Colin, or Curlin, I guess as they say there. This is Colin, and they were under the army was under strict orders. You bomb the whole city. Do not touch the churches. Interesting. They sent Americans over there, and we took the stained glass windows out of all the churches, brought them to the basement, and protected them so when the churches were bombed, we would not destroy the windows. I can see why. I mean, these are treasures of the world. These aren't just treasures of Germany. When I went to Germany, of course, one of the first places we went to was, we climbed up, it's good exercise, all the way to the top, the stairway. And so these were incredibly beautiful churches. But it's interesting when you look at the cities that were bombed, most of the churches, or at least many, were saved. And my thought is, where were the Christians in objecting to the war? And there's another picture. And there you can see a picture of the devastation. Essentially, American and British bombers pretty well leveled every major city in Germany. Not one major city was left. They were pretty well flattened. And that's an example of one. There's another picture. There's another picture. This is Hamburg. And you can see that they didn't just bomb it, they firebombed it. They dropped bombs which produced fire, which destroyed the city. And there's another example. And there's another example. And there you can see the people who survived are trying to, well, survive. And there is Berlin. You know, that's Hamburg, I think, again. Another picture. And of course, we all know about the ovens. What Hitler attempted to do must be ranked alongside the most heinous crimes of history, and Darwin as the father of one of the most destructive philosophies in history. This is page 101 of a reference book that I used. It's clearly there. And if Hitler was a creationist, accepted the idea that we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, you think there would have been a World War II? You think he would have tried to destroy the Jews? What he probably would have done is what Germany has done now, is Germany built themselves up as a great materialistic economic powerhouse. And now who runs Europe? What's the head of Europe? Germany. Right? Germany dominates economically Europe. So why do they need the war? They just should have worked hard and built a strong government and could have easily, as they have done now, what do they call that, the European Union? Some people said, let's call it the German Union. Others say, wait a minute, we just fought World War II. Let's just call it the European Union. The European Union is Germany dominates, period. Which is well recognized. 55 million people died. And this is a eugenics board. USA, thousands were sterilized. And I mentioned, this is the Minnesota Eugenics Society. And they basically wrote a letter to Adolf Hitler saying, Brother Hitler, we're with you. Keep working, keep doing good things. To try to summarize, if Hitler would have accepted the Christian teaching and the teaching of science that we're all descendants from Adam and Eve, there would not have been World War II, and the world would be a very different place. And yet when I say it that way, people get very upset. In fact, some posts online which condemn me, one of the things they point out, Bergman said that Darwin had something to do with Hitler. He had nothing to do with Hitler. And so that's just not true. And so they mostly respond to that, partially because, and I've only briefly touched on, I'm trying to cover a variety of material here. A lot of pictures helps you see the whole picture, but it's one way of presenting what's going on. But more information, lots of good quotes are in my 3 books on World War II and on Hitler. And by the way, the one on Hitler I wrote is by far the best-selling book I've ever produced. It's the only book I really made any money on. All the other books I broke even or took a loss. So a lot of people are interested in Hitler. I ask why in several places I went to. One reason is most of you, I bet, have German background. How many have some German background? Raise your hand. Well, over half of you. And so therefore, it's not these dirty other people somewhere else that we can't pronounce their name. It's our relatives. It's our people. I'm told that when deciding on an official language for America, Germany lost by a couple of votes. English won. There are a couple of votes different. We would all be speaking German now, because that would be the official language of the United States. One other thing is that since I've been in Germany a number of times, I always find it amazing how really, really friendly they are. And the other presentation I gave, I mentioned when I was walking down the street, a woman opened the window and told me in German, my daughter married an American man, is a good man. Good son-in-law. Like Americans. And you could still see the holes in the buildings, which were put there by the war. Another example was when I was trying to find in a museum, it was lost. So I knocked on this door and this woman answered, and I just asked for directions. She knew if I knew enough English and I knew enough German, I could ask her. And she then says, I take you there. No, I want to walk. I want to see the sights. No, I take you there. You get in my car, I take you there. And so I got in her car and she drove me to the museum. I want to make sure you got it. You got here. You could see this museum. And by far the most friendly people, I've traveled pretty much the whole world, by far the most friendly people were the German people. And a lot of you travel a lot, you probably partially agree with that. And what's the point of mentioning that? We often say the Nazis are bad people. The Nazis were, look what the Nazis did. Look the horrible things they did. And they did horrible, horrible things. But the problem was they were misled. And they really believed so much of what was taught by the German scientist Ernst Haeckel and his followers. And they really believed this and thought in the long run they were doing good. It was Goebbels who said, history will regard us as heroes. We were able to kill all of these inferior people, produce a superior race, and they will honor us and this Holocaust not as a bad thing, but as a good thing, because we have produced a superior race in the world. And so we can be proud. Not now. It's hard now to shoot all these Jews in the head like they're doing. It's hard to do that now, but in the long run, what you are doing is honorable, and you will be remembered forever for what you have done to help humanity. So when I worked in the prison, I worked with people who were, one guy they claimed murdered 12 girls. He was found guilty, given 3 life sentences. I thought he was one of the nicest guys I've ever worked with. We corresponded, had a lot of things in common. He liked Mopars, I liked Mopars. He was a student at Eastern Michigan University, had good letters. In fact, I have not been able to read the book called The Michigan Murders, the book about all the people he supposedly killed. Just couldn't read it. And so we need to get rid of the idea that these people there's something wrong with them. Well, what's wrong is they were misled. And that is especially true in Germany. They were misled, and they really sincerely believed what they were taught was true. Another example is today, Americans are misled in evolution. They're good people, but they've been grossly misled to accept an idea that is totally without foundation, and that is all life can be produced by the accumulation of genetic mistakes. That's not true at all. We take questions now, or is there? Nobody's sleeping, so that's a good, when I was teaching the college level, especially biochemistry, a good sign is no one's sleeping. So my students would say, all right, not one person slept in this class. So you're doing good.
Okay, so we will do questions and answers. And if you have a question, let me know that you've got the question and I will get the mic to you. So don't say anything until you've got the mic in front of you. So with that, who's got a question?
In your view, what is the best way to reach an evolutionist in love?
It's difficult because one thing that always amazed me was how hostile they are. The anger, the veins in their face show. And I have to wonder why. Well, you know why. People tell me why when I mention this, because that's their religion. It's the way that they believe. As one evolutionist told me, if you're right, I'm going to spend eternity in hell. The best way, I think, is not only tactfully, but something that is simple, like, you have a dog? Yeah, I have a dog. How are things going? Oh, my dog is just, I'll tell you, I just love this little guy to death. Boy, you know, I have a dog too, and I'll tell you, when I look at my dog, I think of the Creator, that God created dogs specifically to meet our needs. What do you think of that idea? You think that's my thought. I can't help but see in my dog that this creature was created specifically for my needs, to be companions for me. So something innocuous like that may help open the door. But yeah, you are correct. It is very difficult to reach evolutionists because they get angry so quickly. You found that they get angry very quickly. So, question of the day. And even other things like the sunset or travels. My brother used to live in Maui, and it's such a beautiful place. And I can say things like, when I go to visit my brother in Maui, you know, it just reminds me of God. God created this paradise for us, for our enjoyment. It just reminds me of our Creator. What do you think? And he might say, well, yeah. Question, go ahead.
I think it was C.S. Lewis that said something like, sin, when we sin, it's trying to get something good, but the wrong way to go about it. I was wondering if you would say that for Hitler, because he did create a Volkswagen car company, not he himself, but he hired someone to do that, and
Porsche, yeah.
that's a good thing, but obviously the other stuff he did was not good.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point, that he was really trying what he thought was, in the long run, to be good. He thought in the long run he was going to create a superior race, a bunch of happy, really intelligent Germans walking around the world. That's what he thought. And he had a hard time with certain things like, what's wrong with Britain? They should be on our side. What are you siding for the other? America. Of course, America he thought was a problem because we had so much intermarriage. We're marrying all these Indians and these American Indians and these blacks. So he wasn't quite as positive to Americans as he was to Great Britain. He loved Swedes, of course. And he tolerated Danes, but not but they were part of the Aryan race. So he had a hard time understanding our attitudes, but of course we see the world in very different ways. Okay, go ahead.
End times prophetic scripture indicates that the house of Israel will go through a purging and refining process. Do you see any markings of World War II type persecution developing again? Many believe that we're in an end times period now. Do you see the potential for something to reoccur?
Well, yeah, you see a potential, but one good thing that happened out of World War II is most countries, I hope, have learned their lesson. But with Putin in Ukraine, maybe not. But on the other hand, it seems that most people, most countries have to a large degree, I hope, appears, learned their lesson. But that my wife's in a prophecy, and boy, I hear all kinds of, and I've heard that explained as well. So the problem, the advantage we have is the natural order is out there. We can see it. Want to study worms? We can study it. Want to study cows? We can study them. Want to study bees? We can study them. We can learn a lot about the natural world without a lot of question. where prophecy is, Christ himself made it very clear about the last days. And no one knows the day and the hour. Not the Son, but only the Father knows the day and the hour. And yet so many groups have predicted the day and the hour. In the past century, there's just a whole long list of that. The guy who was the head of that Christian radio station, but he predicted it a certain date and didn't come, so he came up with another date. So I guess I try to be. But on the other hand, I certainly don't want to encourage people not from studying prophecy. Like I say, that's my wife. My wife thinks all these creation talks I give her baloney.
Yep.
She does. She says, I'm a creationist, always been. How could anybody be so stupid as to be an evolutionist? Therefore, lovely husband, what are you talking to these groups for? What's wrong with them? Why would they accept some stupid idea like evolution? Well, that's what she believes, and she always believed that. But on the other hand, you know a lot of people who are not stupid, who are very intelligent, who do accept evolution. So, but my wife loves, she has all these, Kahn, I forget his first name, but she has piles of books on prophecies which she reads carefully. So I want to encourage you to continue studying prophecy, and I guess we can't know too much about prophecy and the Bible and the natural world, but I'm just trying to work on one thing at a time. But thank you for your comment. Other questions?
More of a comment.
Okay.
It is very interesting to me still how much the media and so many things push that. Honestly, that perfect Swedish-looking girl that you flashed up on there. It's amazing to me. You look at the Barbie doll, you look in just on TV magazines. It's like they're pushing that's what beauty is. And if there's anybody who kind of doesn't look like that, well, too bad, honey. Sorry you just didn't get the good looks or whatever. And it's really sad to me.
Yeah, that's a good comment. It's more males commit suicide than females, but more females attempt suicide than males. And I think I've worked in this area for a while. One reason is that a lot of women they hold up these gorgeous, young, blonde, blue-eyed gals, and so many look in the mirror and they just, it's not me. And they have inferiority feelings because of the image that we try to put forth as being ideal. And so that's a good point. That's a problem. I tell my wife she's beautiful every day. Of course she is, actually. But I tell her that just to make sure. She knows that. And she'll complain about something and, she's got some scar here and there. And I just say, honey, I'm not going to look at your scar. That's not what I'm concerned. You are a beautiful person. End of story. Other comments?
I've always found it so hard to believe that people would have gone along and, that good, German people would have, been willing to be so easily misled. But then when we kind of see the correlation of, what's happened recently, like from the pandemic, or where good, smart, intelligent people, good Christians, easily just went to formation with that. Have you kind of drawn any conclusion from that?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I need to be less pessimistic, I know, but it does get discouraging. One thing we need to get into churches. More and more. I did a radio show in Pittsburgh and a TV show. And they paid all my expenses. And I said, since I'm driving to Pittsburgh, and I hate to drive, but it's an 8-hour drive. Since I'm driving to Pittsburgh, maybe you can find a church I can go to on Sunday. Because Saturday was the interview. Sunday you can find a church that I can go to. Use my time wiser. And he said, I've called every church in the area, and they all said, you're not welcome. But we're doing a show on him Saturday. Could he come by Sunday and do a sermon at your church? No, we're not interested. And so, now one church could we get into. Every year I go to Chicago and go to one church. There are hundreds of churches in Chicago. Do you think we have been able to get one of these that I could do when I'm in Chicago? Maybe I could go to 2 churches and not one. Not one other church has said they've invited me. So it's so difficult to get in, partially because a lot of pastors say it's irrelevant, it doesn't matter. Genesis is symbolic. The flood of Noah is a story like other stories. They're not literal, and therefore you're a nice guy, but you're not welcome. And so we get this over and over. Or they say the sermon time. Now, some churches I go to, but I go to on Wednesday. But they do not give me sermon time. I can't do a presentation on Sunday because Sunday is for the sermon. And sermon is about the missionary trips of Paul, the story of Jonah. This is what sermon is about. It's not about this creation stuff. And so it's difficult. Usually, though, when I get into a church once, I'm invited back. So they have a lot of misconceptions. It's controversial. And I mentioned I've done presentations at over 400 churches, and not one of the churches was anything controversial. I wish it was. I wish I could get some controversy going, because that creates good discussion. People listen, they remember, they think. But when I finish, people say, "Oh, nice job, Dr. Bergman. Enjoyed your presentation. Nice job. See you later." I get, even just personally, "Dr. Bergman, I heard your presentation. I got a problem. Let me tell you." I love that. I don't get it. All I get is, I agree. So when pastors say it's controversial, I'd like to say, really? Is the Bible controversial? So, church here, if any of you have attended church, we've got speakers that come every month to this group. I'm sure they can find we've got 2 or 3 local speakers that can do a great job. Try to ask your pastor, "I'd like to have a creation speaker come here." Or just someone can speak on apologetics. Wouldn't that be a good idea? And the pastor, no, we want to present the gospel. And that's just tragic, I think. Other comments on that? Is what I said controversial? No. How many agree? Most agree. So, other comments? So write letters to the newspaper, be active, don't be afraid. My church, I mentioned something against abortion. One of the ladies walked out. "This is church. You don't talk about politics. I don't want to hear politics in church." And I talked about one of the presidential candidates who's really pushing abortion. Really, that was a main theme of her campaign. And I mentioned that. And she didn't want to hear that. So I always thought God knew you before you were born. It sounds to me like you're a living being, and it sounds to me like abortion is killing someone who God knew before he or she was born. Seems pretty clear to me. That among other scriptures. But she didn't want to hear that, so she walked out.